Okay, before we get into applying color to a black and white image, there are two more things we need to cover. The first thing is hue, saturation, and lightness, sometimes referred to as hue, saturation, and value. Now, inside of Photoshop, from time to time, we'll adjust things so that we can see hue, saturation, and lightness, and instead of like a hexadecimal, for example, let me bring up this bad boy real quick. I've built a big color wheel. It's a couple of different sets. This is actually from Latex, which is a wonderful sort of InDesign competitor. It's mostly used by mathematicians. They have this free image available online for people to use, so I went ahead and grabbed that. This guy is from the Wikipedia. Thank you, Wikipedia. And then I built this little guy. So we've got degrees in here for some reason, and we'll get to that in just a second. First, though, let me show you what I mean by hue, saturation, and lightness. Remember hue, saturation, and brightness? Well, it's the same thing. So one thing that I've glossed over a number of times is degrees. I've said that we can bring brightness to something like 50% and get into gray type areas, especially if we have everything else set to 0. But I've kind of not said what degrees mean. And the reason for that is that we normally have this square for picking colors, but a color wheel, such as this one, could be measured in degrees instead. And for those of you who have gone through trigonometry, you'll know why we have 360 degrees, but for the rest of us, it's a great way to divide things, essentially. And so we just picked an arbitrarily large number that's easy to divide by a number of other numbers. And then at 360 degrees of rotation, that's just little slices here, you'll get back to your start. So 0 and 360 are the same. So if you ever did a 180, that's when you've turned all the way around. But a 360, you're right back to where you started. Okay, so you've got that, right? Now, there's a reason why we need to bring that up. The hue, saturation, lightness, or hue, saturation, value, or hue, saturation, brightness are alternate representations of the RGB color model. And we've been talking about RGB throughout the semester. If you recall, it's how you break things apart so that you can see everything. That's about it. Now, in this case, it was designed in the 1970s by computer graphics researchers to more closely align with the way human vision perceives color-making attributes. In these models, color of each hue, and there you can see some hues. One of the main properties of color, defined technically as the degree to which a stimulus can be described similar or different from stimuli such as red, green, blue, and yellow. Hue can typically be represented quantitatively by a single number of, oh my gosh, that's a lot of words, right? Well, hue, it's just the color, like the difference between a blue and a yellow. And it's different from how bright that color is and how saturated that color is. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's basically the rainbow. All right, so in these models, colors of each hue are arranged in a radial slice, and a radial slice is just another way of doing degrees, so don't worry about that, around a central axis of neutral colors, which arrange from black at the bottom and white at the top. Well, hold on. Looking at this, that's not the case at all. What are they talking about? Well, they're talking about this. They built not a circle, but a cylinder. And actually, if we scroll down further, they have some more fun. They can build it out of cones or two cones on top of each other and all of that stuff. So the idea is that with the hue, saturation, lightness, or hue, saturation, value, or hue, saturation, brightness, which isn't on this page, you have the color wheel at the top, and then from the center out, you have the saturation levels, with the most saturated being at the edge and the least saturated being in the center. And then going up and down, you have the value, where the value is just a mixture. If you removed all saturation, you would have, depending on the value, white or black. Let's just view this for a second so that I can demonstrate that a little more clearly. If you remove all of the saturation from any color on the color wheel, you will get just a tone, and that tone will either be white if you have a maximum value, some mixture of gray as you drop it, and then at the bottom, black. That's what it means to have a 0 saturation. The value is going to be the only thing you see. No matter what hue you've selected, when you've brought it into the center, it just is desaturated completely, right? So it's just white Or if it's a darker value, black. Got that? That's what value is. This is a nice little way to just demonstrate it straight away. In fact, I think it's nice enough we don't really need to keep reading this, but just for the heck of it, here's the black at the bottom, white at the top. You can flip that depending. The hue saturation value representation models the way paints of different color mix together with the saturation dimension resembling various tints of brightly colored paint, and the value dimension resembling the mixture of those paints with varying amounts of black or white paint. So it's really a way that you can color it. The hue saturation lightness model attempts to resemble more perceptual color models such as the natural color system or the Munsell color system. I'll leave this for the interested reader, but essentially it places fully saturated colors around the circle at a lightness value of 1/2, where lightness is 0 and 1, fully black or white respectively. Don't worry about that. The part we're taking out of this is that there's a cylinder of stuff going on. Now, with that in mind, we can start playing with this inside of Photoshop, because there's something we've touched on that takes advantage of this right away, and now we can finally delve into what's happening in this. So first, this bar, if you notice, if you were to wrap this around a cylinder, we would end up with this little rainbow going straight across. Now, you'll notice too that if you start off with just black and white and you double click, it always has red as the default. Now, I've always found this a bit dangerous because oftentimes if you start monkeying around in grays, it's easy to end up with what's called a warm gray because it has red mixed in it. Cool grays, such as these blues, are usually easier on the eye to look at, and there are times that you'll want to use one or the other depending. But there's a reason why if you start with standard black, it's in the red area. That's because in the hue saturation brightness field, they've set it up so that 0 degrees is red. So if you've zeroed everything out, 0, 0, 0, the hue that you're in is going to be red. If you brought it up to, say, 180, you'd have the cyan colors. And I've gone ahead and labeled all of these. I believe these are correct, just for fun here. You can see the website that I used. It's called the Encyclocolorpedia. It's a little hard to go there, but that's just ENCY color, and that's the American COLOR pedia, PEDIA.com. You can put in a hex value and we'll tell you what color you're in, which is great. And we'll also tell you about the wavelengths and all kinds of fun stuff. It's a great little website. All right, so I've labeled these degrees appropriately. Now, why did I go to all this trouble? Why did I assemble all these images? Well, if you'll recall, on the adjustment layer, the little black-white icon, we have something called hue saturation. Now, I'm going to get rid of this mask because we don't need it. So I'll have this at the top, so it's going to affect everything. Let's take a look at really what this is doing, because we've kind of danced around a few of its features. Let me just make it a little bit bigger so that we can really get into it. Now, we have the hue, the saturation, and the lightness, the HSL. And we were just looking at it. It's essentially a cylinder, sometimes a cone. It's a way of demonstrating it. So now, with these degrees, we can watch rotations occur. I don't have any of the other settings going on right now. I'm just going to grab this and spin it. And you can see as I drag it to the right, and this gets a little saturated in my main piece here. It's because it's not absolutely perfect, but if you look at the one from Wikipedia, it will be a little bit better. You can see that it's rotating, and on Wikipedia, it's clearly rotating right. And just watch the small circle there, it will rotate to the left. And so you can see that this one's a little funky inside of it. So for the sake of simplicity, boom, I'm just going to turn that off for a second. So changing the degrees to a negative value rotates it left, to a positive value rotates it to the right. You can even watch those words spin around right in there. Now notice this bar at the bottom. That's your destination. The bar at the top is the original color. So you can see that that is also rotating around with it. So that's all that's going on there. Let me reset that. Ready to turn back on our big old color wheel here. So you can see red's at 0 degrees, cyan's at 180. We've got 90 degrees, kind of a lime color, the actual pure green. We've got 120, violet at 270, all this great stuff. It's fun times. I'll try to remember to put this up as a file you guys can download. If I forget, just let me know and I'll post that for you. All right, so we've got a hue. easy enough. It's a way to rotate. Now there's some more to it, and we'll get back to it in just a moment, but let's finish up on the main controls. We have saturation. Let's go ahead and really pay attention to this color wheel in the center here, or sorry, not in the center, on the side here. As I increase the saturation, you can see that all those gray colors just fade away, and eventually we get to full saturation. If I decrease the saturation, everything just becomes dull grays. Here it is with 0 saturation. We can have white, we can have grays, we could potentially have blacks depending on what's going on in there. But in this case, that's all saturation's doing. Exactly the same sort of thing that we saw on our hue saturation value controls here, where the saturation bar will reduce things to either a black or a white, depending on its value. Okay, so we've got all that going on, but we have more. We have lightness, and now this just mixes in essentially white to black. And so this is more of an effect that tends to be used and less of a color mixture. Lightness is generally used to create the structure of the image. If you have a black and white image, you're looking at different amounts essentially of, since you have no saturation, you're just looking at different amounts of lightness, either black to white. That's all that's going on there. That's the black and white image. So in Photoshop, hue and saturation equals color. So when we have color adjustments, it's affecting both hue and saturation. There are many times you prefer to just adjust hue or saturation, so keep that in mind. All right, now that said, we have the option of colorize. Let's check in colorize. And you can see that with colorize, all of a sudden the hue jumps down to 0. And what it's doing is as we put in different degrees, it will do different controls. So supposedly different controls, it will put in a different cast of colors with the lightness essentially controlling what it looks like from there, along with the saturation, what it looks like from there. The lightness essentially controlling how dark or light something is. There we go. And the saturation, how vivid it is. And so let's deal with this a little bit at a time. Supposedly 120 is green. So let's punch in a 120 degrees. Sure enough, we've got the green color. But it doesn't look like the green we saw before. That's because the saturation was cranked all the way up. And what do I mean by that? If we click on, say, this, we are getting now green, as in 255 green. Now, if I brought the saturation down to, say, 50%, and I came back in and clicked on it, notice that I'm getting a different mixture of green here. It's been brought back down considerably along, well, this would be the z-axis in 3 dimensions, but essentially along this angle. So we've got 65 for red out of 255, and we've got 65 for blue, and then just 192. So the saturation has been reduced. If we kick over to the saturation, you can see that's really what's happening. And if we kept dropping the saturation, we would eventually get exactly that. So if we cranked it up to maximum amount, supposedly 0 will give us red. And cyan we could get at 180. Perfect. Everything's working as expected. 300 for magenta. There it all is. Supposedly we could get to orange, I think, at 30 degrees. Let's see if we get that. Yeah, so everything's working as expected. I don't want to colorize right now. Colorize can be fun for a few effects, but frequently you don't really need to get into that. All right, so that said, there are a couple more things you can do here. Let's reset everything back to the defaults. Notice that we have, of course, first presets, which will do things like yellow boosts, or old style, which just kind of dims things down. There's more though. Let's go back to the default. Under master, we could instead just affect the reds, and notice that this is now being adjusted. Now we will target only the reds. We can spin those around and get them to any kind of hue that we want. Pretty crazy, right? What if we want all of our reds to have more saturation? Well, then leave the hue alone and just boom, crank up the saturation. And you can see on this tiny circle, it's very saturated. Desaturate the reds, not a problem. Now all of our reds are grayed out entirely. All right, so you can target those, but notice that once you get into it, you can actually adjust what's being affected. And it has a runoff, and it has these little splittable controls again. And it has, lo and behold, our eyedropper tools. So if we were to select something like green, it would come in and affect the green areas. If we affected something like clicked on something like yellow, boom, we get the yellows. Well, what about if we want to add to it? Not a problem. Now we'll encompass the oranges and the greens. We're just whitening it. What if we want to subtract from it? No problem. We can knock those back in a little bit at a time until we get to just one section. Pretty cool, right? Let's go ahead and reset that so that nothing is being affected. Boom. And we'll go back to normal. Now there's another way, default I should say, there's another way to do this. There's the targeted adjustment tool. Now this is an actual tool. We've seen it. I've called it the on-screen adjustment tool in the past, which is accurate, but I believe the technical name is actually targeted adjustment tool. It's a real tool. If we click on it, the toolbar will no longer be selected because this is a tool. This is it. We have sample sizes. Do you want to take the average of 101 by 101 pixels? So a big square, a smaller square, just a point, the exact point you click on? Yeah, probably just the exact point you want to click on would be what you want. So let's say that I grab, I don't know, something in the cobalt area. Oh, look at that. It's selected that area for me. And more than that, if I drag it right or left, it will control the saturation. If I hold down the control key and drag it left or right, it will control the hue. So I can target specific areas that way as well. Let me reset everything. So that's all fine and dandy. It gives us a lot of different controls, but it also starts to reveal how Photoshop handles color coordinates through the hue, saturation, and lightness. This is a very powerful tool, and we can use this for a lot of situations. It's a great way to bring things under control. If you recall, when you were doing your blending adjustments, or blending modes, I should say, it would have been nice to have one of these, because if you got something like way out of control, you can just get your targeted adjustment tool, grab a color that's going crazy, and just desaturate it a little bit, and you'll be set. That's all there is to it. Just giving these pieces, giving ourselves access to these pieces is incredibly powerful. And it goes a little bit further than that. Once you've got some adjustments you like, if you have a whole bunch of photos that were taken in the same location and you need to do the same thing to all of them, guess what? You can save your preset and then you can load it back in later. And you can also load in presets that other people have created. So there's a lot of power here. Don't forget, as an adjustment layer, it's possible to create this so that it clips to just the layer below it. And you can do that with the Alt click. You can do that with your layer tools just underneath your I believe it's clipping mask, yep, right there. Or you can just use this tool right here. Anyway, that is the hue saturation control, and that's how Photoshop handles hue saturation and lightness, or hue saturation brightness. All right, I'll see you next video. We're going to talk about desaturating things and how Photoshop handles that. See you in a minute.